Welcome to Heartline Ministry. You know, it's so amazing how God can take what would be a seeming disaster and turn it into a blessing. And He can do that in your life too. We're going to talk about that this morning.
Celebrating Christ our King, lifting up His holy banner, marching into the promised land. Chains of sin have now been broken. There is glory in this place, where the Joshua generation walking in His amazing grace, walking in His amazing grace.
Well, once again, greetings. We want to welcome you for tuning into Heartline Ministry. We have been studying the wonderful book of Esther. And Tim, I just love this book. I just, it goes from taking a little Jewish girl, making her the queen, and then you watch and see all the drama that takes place. Mm-hmm. And then now we're getting into the victory of it all. Yeah. In the next few chapters, we're going to see wonderful victory. But what seems to be a disaster, what really seems to be something that was not going to end well, and how God turns it around. And as we look in chapter 6, we're going to see how God can instruct even to the reading of a book, mm-hmm. Or instruct even in the insomnia of the king, and all of that. Just the way God orchestrates and puts everything together. To me, it's a beautiful, beautiful story of the reigning of God. Mm-hmm. And even when you don't think He's there, He's there.
Yeah, and not just with the fact that He was able to use these very dynamics, like you said, how, He wasn't able to sleep or the reading of a book, but also how He's able to use a heart, something that we as people cannot see. There's no way we can understand. I mean, even as you and I are sitting here, we can talk and we can engage with each other, but what's really going down inside us, right. There's no way, despite all the years that we've known each other, that you really know what's going on in me or vice versa. Right. But yet, right down to the very tidbit of their thoughts, of what's going on in their attitudes, the Lord capitalizes on those things to bring about His end result. Like I said, no matter how much it looked like the cards were stacked against not only Mordecai, but against the Jews as a whole, how in the matter of hours, everything turns the totally opposite direction simply because God knew every aspect of the picture, attitudes, hearts, situations, circumstances, and He tweaks all of them for His glory.
As I was thinking about this, how Mordecai, basically saved the king's life, mm-hmm. because he heard that these two guys were going to try to assassinate the king. Mordecai told the right people, and the king was spared the assassination. Mm-hmm. Nothing happens. No reward, nothing. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden, the king is going to read a book and say, what did I do to reward him? Mm-hmm. Nothing, Your Highness.
Yeah. And what an awesome testimony to Mordecai's humility.
Yep.
That he went through all of that, but never once, when he didn't get recognized, when he wasn't given the accolades, he didn't make any spectacle about that. He didn't try to draw attention to himself like Haman would have.
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to say. To look at the contrast between Haman and Mordecai. Mm-hmm. Haman was upset because one man in the kingdom would not bow to him. Mm-hmm. Yet Mordecai didn't go to the king or go to Esther and say, I saved your husband's life. I really think I ought to get something for this. He doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but he waits upon God, yeah, to orchestrate this beautiful picture now that we're going to see in chapter 6.
Yeah, and when you take all that into consideration, not just that he didn't say those things, but you look at what has transpired just prior to this, the fact that the Jews are getting ready to be executed, that would include him, that would actually end up including Esther. My natural tendency at that point would be, this might be a good time to play my trump card.
Yep.
And maybe remind the king that, look, you wouldn't be here today had I not.
Right.
He would have had every right and to move forward with that. And the situations would almost dictate that maybe he should. But especially knowing the fear that was there. But that was never part of the equation. It was never on his mind even once, or in his heart even once, that maybe I should plead my own case.
Right.
Let's have Esther just see what she can do from her end.
Right.
And let things fall where they fall.
I think we need to remind everybody that, just all that has happened now in the first 5 chapters. You have the king entertaining governors and princes and those in charge of other provinces because he wanted to impress them with his wealth, his power, plus he wanted to get them behind his attack in the war that he was about to ensue. And then, it takes about 4 years, and he loses badly. He wanted the queen to come and present herself before all of these drunken dignitaries. She refused. He dispels the queen. Then he goes, and when he gets back from war, he goes and he presents another beauty contest, so to speak. And here's Esther, who wins it hands down, right? Because the king she found favor in the king.
Yeah.
And then you go, and you got this guy, Haman, who is working himself up the ranks. So now that he's almost like second in command, you have Mordecai, who works himself up in the ranks, but he's still a lowly Jew, according to Haman. And then Haman goes to the king and has this king give him the ring, basically, because Haman's the one who wrote the decree and put the king's seal on it that all the Jews would be killed. How Mordecai and Esther had kind of concealed, if you will, their identity up until this point.
Yep.
They didn't tell the king or anybody that they were Jews. Now, Mordecai lets the cat out of the bag that he's a Jew. Esther is going to let the cat out of the bag. She's a Jew. She goes and invites Haman and the king to 2 different banquets. One night, one the next night. And how God orchestrated all of that with what we're going to talk about in chapter 6 today.
Right.
And even though God is not mentioned, certainly he is implied all through this book. The praying, the fasting, the ashes, the sackcloth, all of that stuff that Mordecai does, and then Esther does, and her handmaidens do, for 3 days to find out how they are going to work this whole situation, and how God works it, how God does it. I couldn't help but think of, even though, we look at it and say, here's a seeming disaster. God is now about to turn it into a blessing. I also thought of, in light of this, is God's sense of humor sometimes. How, somebody wants to build themselves up, make themselves something that they really aren't, and how God has to knock them down. And in looking at sense of humor, I kind of changed my thought on that, because certainly God never wants to see a man or a person die and go to hell. And that is very evident that that's where Haman is. And, God never, he delights in the death of his saints, but he doesn't delight in the death of the ain'ts,
Right.
He just isn't. And so now we're seeing that. So I prefer the turning disaster into blessing, because that's exactly what he has done here. And I don't know, I just love this whole book. I love the drama of it. I love the way you can see God's hand orchestrating, even from, behind, so to speak. and just seeing how all this works, and take it to our own lives. Even
That's
though
right.
we may be facing what we would call a seeming disaster, how God can turn that around to His good.
And again, it's remembering, and I don't want to insult people's intelligence by, again, remembering this is not just a Bible story.
Right.
This is a historical account of something
Exactly.
that actually took place, exactly the way that we see it unfolded
Right.
here. This is a record. This is a historical record that has been written down through the generations. And so we need to realize this isn't just some wishful thinking or like Hollywood creates a script. This is a historical script, if you will, that
Yeah.
God wrote. And we need to understand that this God that we see orchestrating here is the same God that we worship and serve today.
Right.
And He is still the same yesterday, today, and forever.
That's
and
right.
so the things that we see Him doing here, we can trust He'll also do in our own lives.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out, that as we read and study this book of Esther, we can put ourselves in these roles. I mean, how many times have we as people, you and I as pastors, but we as people, look at something in our life and say, this is going to be disastrous. This is going to be bad. And then we can see the hand of God working and turning the table, so to speak, and taking that bad into good. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, for those who love Him, for those who are called according to His purpose.
And that's the key for
That
those
is.
who love Him.
That's right.
And are called according to His
Right,
purpose.
and that's why I think we're seeing this tide turn, or this disaster being turned now to victory, because it is for His people. It's for the Jews.
Yeah, and we have seen their response in the midst of all this. Unlike other times where they tend to go their own way, as soon as disaster is seen on the horizon, they immediately fall to their knees.
Right.
And they immediately begin to pray and to fast and to show signs of repentance with the sackcloth and ashes, to show God that, look, if there is anything that we've done that is bringing this upon us, please forgive us. Not so that we will simply be spared, but because we want to be in that place of favor, in that place where our lives are pleasing to you.
Right, and I love that, like in chapter 4, that you're here for a time such as this. I think that if we today, in our own lives, could see that in our lives, why was it that we weren't born 100 or 200, 500 years earlier? Because God has a particular purpose for us, all of us, being here today.
Yep.
So we are born for such a time as this. And I'm looking at it, and I'm, looking at all that is happening in our world and culture and everything else, and saying, man, can it get much worse? Well, I have to remember, God put me here for a purpose. And this is a time that He wants to use us to right the ship, so to
Yep.
speak. And that's what he is now doing, starting in chapter 6.
Yep.
He's going to right the ship again, and we're going to see the great victories from 6 on through that God is doing.
Yeah.
But we have to look at it. How can I apply this to my life? Well, let's think of ourselves as Mordecai and say, Lord, you have something very definite that you want to do, and we know that you can do it. And I'm not going to live in defeat. The enemy would love to have all of us live in defeat. But instead, I like it like in 1 Corinthians 15:57, and the victory that is ours through the Lord Jesus Christ. No matter what you're facing, the victory is ours.
Yeah.
And we need to see that.
That's it. And especially when we consider how big this ship is
Yep.
that God's turning and how quickly He turned it.
Right.
Everything was stacked against them. It would look on the surface that there's no way that anything good can come out of this whatsoever. But their faith still remained unshaken, and because of that, God was able to come through in the way that He desired.
Yeah, it's exciting. So we're going to be getting into chapter 6. I'm going to open in prayer and ask the Lord to be with us as we teach and as we talk about chapter 6. And then Pastor Tim's going to read the chapter to us, and then we will discuss it. So let's bow and ask the Lord to be with us. Father, we thank you so much for this wonderful book of Esther. And Father, how we can see that it applies to our own hearts and lives today. And as Tim said, Father, this is a historical account that happened. This is not just a fairy tale. This is not just a story, but it is a historical account of how you took disaster and turned it into victory. So, Father, help us to see clearly now this chapter 6, and to watch your hand molding and shaping as the potter does the clay into the vessel that you want us to be. Father, do that with us. And, Lord, use us for your glory, and we thank you in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Tim's going to read chapter 6.
Yeah. So before we do, just getting a little backdrop, just because it helps us understand the beginning of 6. So you mentioned before about the 2 feasts.
Right.
One has happened. One dinner party has happened with Haman and the king, the Esther's throne, one night, and then we are in that in-between time, between that night and the next night. So
Right.
It's a 24-hour time span. Haman came away feeling great because he was so well honored, but yet Mordecai is really kind of upset the apple cart
Yep.
in the fact that Haman can't get his mind off Mordecai, who was the reason why he wanted to have all the Jews killed, so he kind of mask the purpose for killing Mordecai. But now he is so upset that he now says, I can't deal with this. And so his wife actually gives the recommendation, build the gallows,
Right.
have him hung before you have to go to the party the next night.
Right.
So party one night, this discussion, gallows being built so Mordecai can be hung before the next dinner 24 hours later.
So that Haman could really enjoy the second party.
Exactly.
Right. But I think let's just go back just for a second. You know, who are the players? You got Haman, who is an Agagite. They should have been totally wiped off the face of the earth if the Jews had followed God's instructions.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't. So now these people, the Agagites, are coming back now to haunt the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
because now they want to annihilate the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and which are God's people. And so we're seeing that they're on the verge of that.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're going to see the tide turn
Mm-hmm.
from not the Jews being destroyed, but this one Hagagite who is going to be, and his family, by the way,
Yeah.
that's going to be destroyed instead. So God, once again, is turning that tide.
Mm-hmm.
But it starts now, tonight, with this account.
Yep. So dinner happened. Discussion happened that evening when he got home. We're going to build the gallows. And just within a couple hours after that, the king goes to bed, right?
Yep.
And it tells us that night, at verse 1, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. You know, that had to be a gripping book, huh?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." After Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurries to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared.
And this is where I get the thought, Tim, where God's sense of humor to me is beautiful. I think sometimes we don't picture God as one who has a sense of humor. But I see his sense of humor in this, in that Haman thinking that he is going to be made a big deal of, where in fact God takes Haman's enemy, Mordecai, and makes Haman go and honor him.
Yep.
To me, that's a great sense of humor that our Lord has, is he pulls the rug out from underneath him, so to speak, from being the honored to now honoring his enemy.
And even more than that, his reason for even entering that court in the first place was to get the king to hang this man that now he is having to turn and honor, and given quite the decree by the king saying, don't you dare leave out anything that you yourself have said should be done for this man. Haman, out of your own lips, you have chosen to honor this man. Because I asked you what I should do. And as we know, as with this king's normal tendency, he apparently makes no decisions by himself. Very unkingly. It's always somebody else that he always asks what should be done. And so he ends up actually sealing his honor. And man, how that must have just I don't think you can really capture in words. I mean, they tried there at the end of that area where it said Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. That doesn't do justice to what must have been going through Haman's mind at this time. I mean, such great anger, such great regret and mourning that not only is he not going to get hung, and not only is he going to get honored, I am the one that's going to have to parade him in the streets and actually shout his praises. It's just amazing.
Well, you take, just let's go back a few chapters and take, wait a minute, Haman had the penman write up this decree that he hung on the doorposts of all the cities and towns so that everybody would read it. Now, what is happening? This man, Haman, is now taking the one that he decreed to be killed, and he's honoring him. That must have been a terrible embarrassment for Haman. And because everybody knew it. Everybody had read this decree. What I find very interesting is in chapter 6, we do not find the king giving any mention of the decree. Was he unaware of all the decree? Or is it that he just, being the guy that he is, does not remember? It's almost like when he came back from the 4 years of war, did he really remember that he had banned Vashti? Because it said that he was thinking about Vashti and he was about to invite her to come back when his buddy said, no, you can't do that. So it's almost like his memory is very short. And it appears to be very short here too, because he's not thinking about the decree that Haman had written up and had posted in all the provinces and all the cities for everybody to read. And now Haman has to walk through the city streets honoring this man. I just can't imagine the embarrassment that is there. To me, especially like if you go back to chapter 5, verse 13, yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Now, not only sitting at the gate, but now riding the king's horse. Now having the king's robe on. Now having the crown, everything. Boy, you turn chapter 5:13, where he was bewailing what was happening because he wouldn't stand before him. Now look what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, he's even leading the horse.
Uh-huh.
I just love this story. I just
Yeah.
love this whole account of what's
And then
happening.
and then you even go as far as all of his servants and his wife. The last two verses of the previous chapter, the last verse, really.
Right, yeah.
She's saying, you know what? Have this man killed. Have him hung on the gallows. To the end of the very next chapter, basically saying, you know what, Haman, doesn't look like things are going to go well for you after all.
Yeah.
I mean, they've totally flipped from, just do away with him. He's really of no issue to you, to
Right.
now all of a sudden saying, you know what, you're done for.
Yeah. And I like that because, verse 13 of chapter 6, and we're going to get, go over it again, but then Haman told Zeresh his wife and all the friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, for thou shalt surely fall before him. All of a sudden, they're changing their tune and saying, something, we can't beat the Jews because they're God's people.
Yep.
And their God is going to protect them.
Yep. And we're seeing it happen
Yep.
even now.
Even now, as we speak. Haman, you're doomed.
Yep.
She didn't have that in verse 14 of chapter 5, but now the tide has turned because they have no idea how God was going to change the whole setting in just a matter of a few hours.
Yeah, but as you had said even a few weeks ago, that given Haman's heritage as an Agagite, that he was, and you were very well versed in history.
Yeah.
It's not like today. We
Right.
take a little class. I mean, it was inbred into you, your history, and any nation that had risen up against you or that was an enemy, that was passed down from generation to generation to generation. And so were the stories associated with that look, and he would have been informed about the fact that, look, we should have been toasted by the Israelites, but we weren't. They spared us, but you know what? They still made us their slaves.
Yep.
And so there was this dissension that was at play. And so he knew of the kind of deliverance that God had brought to Israel from day one, and how they went with their tail between their legs because they didn't want to be toasted as a people, right? But now here they find themselves in a situation where they once again not only see what's happening today, but see what's happening in that day in light of what had happened in the past. And history is replaying itself. So we need to not take this lightly.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. One of the things, Tim, that I couldn't help but read into verse 1, of chapter 6. And on that night could not the king sleep. Yeah, I couldn't help but read this into it. My friend right over here, Pastor Tim Golden, loves making hot sauce. And it makes it hot. I mean, it is hot sauce. He must have shipped a case of it to Esther because the king could not sleep. I wonder what the chefs put in that meal so that, the indigestion or whatever the case is, he could not sleep that night. For whatever the reason is. But I kind of like to read into it a little bit in my own mind. He must have had some of Pastor Golden's hot sauce in there and kept him awake all night. Whatever it was, he could not sleep. And I guess it's what all of us do, right? We just send for, go get me some of my favorite books, and it happens to be the chronicles of what has happened previously. And this is now, some time has gone. We don't know exactly how long from the time that Mordecai had told the chamberlains of the king that there's two men who want to assassinate him. And they got rid of those two guys. The king was spared. The king had forgotten all about it. But it just so happens, right, coincidence, that the king's chamberlain had chosen that book for the king to read that night.
Just happened to
Just
choose.
so happened. Don't you think, as you can probably tell, neither Tim nor I believe in just coincidence.
Right.
We believe that this is God's planned, orchestrated developments, where God can even be in charge of the book we read. I was reading a story, Tim, about this guy over in South Africa, and he loved to read, and he would read all kinds of books, and he was listening to some kids playing one day, and the song the kids were singing was "Take and Read, Take and Read, Take and Read." So he went down and asked the kids what they were reading, and it happened that they were reading the scriptures. This man who loved to read had never read the scriptures before, but he took them and he read them. And he was gloriously converted. He was, I just lost his name. Is it? Yeah, St. Augustine. It was St. Augustine. And if you know anything about church history, you know that St. Augustine became quite the authority and quite the one who just followed his convictions of Christianity to a T. But it was all because he found a book that the kids say, take and read, take and read, take and read. He read it, and he got saved. Did God orchestrate that for St. Augustine? Of course he did.
Yep.
Did God orchestrate just this one book of the Chronicles that the king had not read yet or had read to him? And, you know, God had it already.
He knew the king if he can't sleep.
Yeah.
He knew the king. God knew the king. I mean, understand how well God knows each and every one of us.
Right.
He knew the king well enough to know that if he can't sleep, he's going to want to have something read. And I know what he's going to want to have read. It's going to be the Chronicles. Now, whether it's because it was gripping or whether it's because it's the most boring book on the face of the planet, I don't know.
Yeah, to make him
but you know, but he also knew the one who was going to go get a book.
Yeah.
And he knew that man well enough to know if I send him to go get a book, this is the book he's going to grab.
Right. Right.
And so, you know, every aspect, but he had to know the mind and heart of each and every person that was involved here. The king, the servant, Haman, Mordecai. I mean, every one of them he had to know to a T.
And the timing.
Yeah.
You know, of Mordecai when he told the king and made it known so that the king would not be assassinated. I mean, everything. I mean, there's nothing God is not in control of, and there's nothing God does not know anything about. And he had this all orchestrated. But you know something? We have this little chorus we sing in our church. You probably do in yours too. In his time, in his time.
Yep.
He makes all things beautiful in his time. Well, that's exactly what chapter 6, verse 1 is talking about.
Yep.
Okay, he's not going to read this book yet, but there's going to be a night he can't sleep. He's going to read the book. On the night just before Mordecai was to be hanged, I'm going to have him read the book.
And we know that this has been at least probably a number of months
Right.
since the whole situation transpired, because we know just from what we've read up to this point that it was after that situation that this whole thing began to develop with Haman's jealousy and hatred towards Mordecai, and then the decree being made, and then the decree being hung. I mean, and then for so many of the Jews then to have read it by that point. So you're talking, this is something that took quite a period of time to do those things. So this would have been written down for, like I said, a number of months before.
I think, Tim, if we go back to chapter 2, we would find that a year has passed. Because remember, the decree was written the first month.
Yep.
And they were not to destroy until the 12th month.
Right.
And obviously, it was now coming to that time where they were going to have that date, and there's only one day, that date in which they were going to be able to try to destroy the Jews. So he could not do that before that time. So it has to be pretty close to that year anniversary that this decree was written. Okay, so we have that because now he's determined. Oh, he's going to be killed tomorrow. Okay, so he does that. So anyway, so he took the books of records of Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now the king didn't read himself; he had someone reading them to him, like a bedtime story. I always find this, Tim, that if I can't sleep and I start reading, especially like if I start reading the scriptures. You know, the devil really wants to put me to sleep after that because he doesn't want me to learn much about it. So, you know, I find it very easily for me to go to sleep after reading a book or the scriptures in particular because it just, the enemy wants me to do that. But here, the king was wide awake. He couldn't sleep. And they start reading to him. So what happens? It found written that Mordecai had told of Bethanna and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king. So they wanted to assassinate the king. This was all chronicled in this book. All right, this is like there's a scribe there who's constantly taking notes of everything that's going on every day. You know, so this is all being chronicled, if you will, or note-taking, and now the king is having this read to him. And then the king asks, verse 3, what honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there's nothing done. What? We looked now through the account. We have looked through all the notes. Nothing has been done to honor Mordecai. So that was the traditional thing. If you do something for the king, like saving him from death, for example, there's going to be great honor due to you. Why? Because you saved the queen, the king, and nothing was done. And I really, I admire them for taking such strict notes. Not leaving anything out. Everything was, the scribes just so chronicled everything to the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's. I mean, everything was so precise. And they were able to look back and say, Your Honor, nothing's been done for Mordecai. Not a thing. So let's say this was 6 months ago, or however long it was. We don't know. But so all of this was absolutely chronicled. So the king said, who's in the court? Must have heard maybe some squires or somebody announcing somebody's in the court. And it just so happens to be Haman, right? It wasn't anybody else, just so happens. So the king said, who's in the court? And Haman was coming into the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king, to hand Mordecai to the gallows, and he had prepared for him. Now, once again, there's going to be another honor given to Haman, because the king is not sitting on his throne, he's in his bedroom. He can't sleep. So now Haman even gets to go into the innermost sanctum of the king's palace, now into this bedroom. So you would think that, wow, I've really been given an honor. The king called for me to even come to his bedroom.
That's it.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So can you just see, God just raising him up, just to cut his legs off from underneath him. What a tremendous account that this was. So he goes before the king. And remember now, he went with one thing on his mind, and what was that? I want to have the king hang Mordecai. I got to get his permission to do that, and I want him to do it before the next banquet, so that I can come merrily, and that's what his wife said, right? That you may go merrily with the king unto the banquet, verse 14 of chapter 5. Right now, she knows her husband can't go merrily. Why? Because Mordecai is still alive. And Mordecai refuses to bow before him. And when Haman is going from his house to the palace, who's there? Mordecai. So his countenance cannot be cheery, because he lets one little guy destroy his whole day. Everybody else is bowing for him, but not Mordecai. So the wife seemingly had a good idea in verse 14 of chapter 5. Kill him, and then you have no reason not to be merry on that day of the banquet. Right? So now he's going before the king in the king's bedchambers, and wants to speak to him about Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant, verse 5, said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. Take him from the court, now into even my bedchambers. And I have a question I want to ask him.
Which right there brings up a very interesting point, because he's in the courts, and we saw this happen just a couple chapters ago with Esther. In the courts, of course, wasn't being spoken from the bedroom, but it's being spoken from the throne. But what happened with her? She was in the court, basically the same thing, let her come in. But how do you do that? By extending the scepter.
Right.
And she came in, and she posed a question. That's normally what happened.
Right.
You know, someone's in the court, they are obviously there to see the king. And so if he invited them in, it was because they had a request to make of the king. But that's where you see things really shift up here, because now he says, let him come in. So he's understanding he's there to inquire something of the king. But before he can ever think about inquiring, the king speaks up and says, I got an inquiry to make of you.
Yeah. And so what a beautiful picture this is of how God is orchestrating this whole drama, if you will, against Haman and for Mordecai. And when everything seems to be, oh no, Mordecai is on his last day of life. He's going to get hanged. The gallows have been made. Haman's going in to make the request. Tomorrow morning, it's all over for him. But no. So we find Haman comes in, verse 6, and the king said to him, before Haman, like you said, before Haman could even get a word out edgewise, the king speaks up and says to him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Immediately, Haman's mind goes to whom?
Himself.
Me. Oh, when the king is asking me this, and I know that I'm the only one that the king wants to honor, I'm going to really play this up good.
And especially when the stage has been set like it is, like you said, I've been invited into the innermost sanctum of the kings. So he would have every right to think at this point that question would be referring to him. I mean, even apart from his pride, because of the honor, because that's not a place everybody was allowed to enter, very few, right? And so it'd be, and then you factor in the pride issue that he had, made it even more so.
You know, and I think that verse 6 really paints that very beautifully for us. This was not just an intellectual thing, because in verse 6 it says, now Haman thought in his heart. He didn't just think in his mind. He wasn't just imagining or trying to picture what's going to happen. No, this was a heart issue, okay? And that's why we call this Heartline, because what is the big issue that we have to deal with? That is with our heart. Well, we find the very same thing with verse 6. It was Haman's heart that was deceitful and desperately wicked above all things. And it wasn't just his intellect. So, and then it goes, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than myself? Man, I'm going to play this up good so that everybody will see that I am a man of great esteem and great honor and all that. So instead of just simply saying, well, give him 1,000 pieces of silver and let it be. No. Let's play this out for everybody to see it. Everybody to recognize I am the man. You know, it's not just simply a simple gift, like let's say 1,000 gold coins or whatever the case may be. No, this is a big production that is being done, okay? This is a big production. So what happens? Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighted to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king uses to wear. Oh, it's even been on the king's shoulders. He's worn it, you know, and do that. And the horse that the king rides upon, oh, nobody else has ridden this horse, because it would have been defiled if anybody else. No, this is the horse that the king has ridden on. Let me ride on that horse.
Now, I see such an incredible picture. And again, you see the enemy's handiwork in Haman, you know, because my mind goes back to what we know about Satan when he was still in heaven. He said he wanted to be like God, you know, and if not, better than, right? And so what you really see in Haman is the same kind of pride. Look, it's obvious to me, even though I'm wrong, but it seems obvious to me I'm the one he wants to honor. So this is my time to look like the king.
Yeah, I can be equal to, if not better than.
Exactly. And so I'm going to wear this up. Now think about, I mean, we've had a lot of stuff on the news lately about the Queen of England.
Yeah.
Now, can you imagine her letting somebody parade around in her royal garb?
Yep.
Or in her royal limo, right?
Yep.
Or anything like that. You wouldn't do that. That is something that is the identity of
Right.
that individual. And so what he's really asking is something almost absurd to be done. But yet the king lets it be done, which is amazing. Of course, it wasn't for Haman. But
Yeah, what I find interesting too is this apparel and this horse. It was not just for a small area within the court of the palace. Let him go into all the streets of the city and lead the horse. You take the bridle and you lead the horse, and you are leading. You are being the servant to this one that is on the horse. Now Haman doesn't know that yet. Until verse 10.
Right.
Then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai. Can you just try to close your eyes and imagine what happened to Haman's face at that moment? Can you imagine just his mouth, huh? Yeah,
Right.
I mean, just bewildered, just wondering, what just happened? What just took place that instead of it being me, it's my worst enemy
right.
that I am going to honor by leading this horse through all the streets, and everybody's going to see me being Mordecai's servant. Wow. I mean, I wish I was there to have seen his face.
Especially knowing the fact that it was because Mordecai wouldn't bow to him that all of this animosity started
Right.
in the first
Yep.
place.
So then took Haman the apparel. He did exactly what the king said. He took the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him. So not only did he lead him quietly, but he had to shout out. Can you just imagine? Because it said
Every
he
word
big-
had to have pained
Every
him.
word had, I love this. And proclaim before him, thus shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Mordecai is the king's favorite. Can you just imagine, or something of that nature?
Right.
Just imagine Haman having to mouth those words. Not just do lip service. He had to scream this out to the top of his lungs that Mordecai was the man. I love it. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning and having his head covered. The shame of it all. Talk about a guy that is just now, if he could have killed himself, he probably would have. It's just, that's how bad it was. I want to die. And he made haste, he went home mourning. I'm sure he was just in tears. Just everything was happening. He even covers his head so that nobody could recognize who he is. Puts on a disguise, if you will. He does that. So he does that. Haman told his wife and all of his friends. So he didn't go home and just see his wife. His friends were there. Why? Because they were there thinking, oh, Haman's going to come home tonight, and he's going to celebrate. And we're going to celebrate with him. It's almost like his wife maybe had planned a surprise celebration, surprise party for Haman. So he goes, and he got all his friends, everything that had befallen him, then said his wise men, and Zeresh, his wife.
But even before they shared, I have to ask myself, how did he come home and how did he share? Because that he didn't just come home to say, oh, poor me. He came home trying to win people over. It's like, you would not believe what happened. In tears, but anger and every possible emotion you can imagine must have been erupting in his very in the fabric of his being, to the point of, can you believe what the king just did to me?
Yeah.
You would not believe what I had to withstand tonight. It's the worst of the worst, and but he wanted to try to paint himself still as being great somehow. And in the midst of that, because with his pride, he wasn't coming feeling humbled.
Yep.
He was humiliated.
I mean, can
And-
you imagine?
And he wanted to be built up by his
Yeah.
people, but rather than being built up,
Yeah.
we went
Well,
into
I
that.
can imagine then he goes to his wife and his friends and say, you know, the king asked me a question, and I told him what I would do, and it wasn't for me. Verse 14, and we got to hurry with this. And while they were yet talking with him, I like to put in here, just in my own mind, and while they were yet trying to console him, because wouldn't that be what they were doing? Mm-hmm. You know, talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hastened to bring him into the banquet that Esther had prepared.
So now it's not a matter of being able to enter into this last banquet with all sorrow off his shoulders. It is at the worst it's ever been.
Instead of
just as he
going
goes in.
merrily, like his wife suggested in verse 14 of chapter 5, he's going to go in much greater sorrow and humiliation.
And somehow had to pull himself together before he got there.
Yeah, because certainly it's just like Nehemiah. Remember what Nehemiah went to the king after he heard about Jerusalem, and what was the first thing the king said to Nehemiah? Why is your countenance so bad? You'd never come before me that way before.
Right.
Do you think maybe the king would see his countenance, Haman's countenance, and say, "What's up? What happened?" You know, we're going to find out next week in chapter 7. I'm Pastor Harold Noyes, pastor of the Community Christian Church. We're located on the Lower Road in Athens, Vermont. We have morning worship at 9:30 every Sunday morning. We have evening worship on Sunday nights at 6 p.m. We also have Bible study during the week. We have prayer meeting on Wednesday night. If you're in our area, we would love to have you stop in and say hi and just enjoy a time of fellowship and worship together of our great King, Jesus Christ.
And if you're in the Charlestown, New Hampshire area, we would invite you to come join us Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock at the Charlestown Senior Center for our Life on Main services. And we just have a great time of worship together there at 11 o'clock every Sunday. And if you want to come for coffee, come an hour early and build some relationship together. We also have cottage prayer meetings at our house at 276 Main Street. Has the Abundant Life Center sign in the front yard that is open to those across denominational lines to be able to seek God's face for revival for our communities in which we live. And we thank you all for tuning into this broadcast. And you can find us on a lot of social media sites, whether it be Rumble, Truth Social, Facebook, YouTube. You can find us on each of those, as well as you find all the programs on Fact's website, which is fact8.com, or on the community TV stations along the Connecticut River Valley as well. And if you have to tune in via podcast, then you can also find us on most popular podcast providers, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and many others.
And we certainly want to thank the staff here at Fact TV for helping us to do this program. So thank you very much. Hope to see you next week.
Chains of sin